Part 1. Troubles a newspaper vending machine. A rusted coin slot that wouldn't yield. A cream-colored envelope wedged inside the mechanism, sealed with red wax and an anchor motif. The microcassette tape inside would lead to his uncle's kidnapping, to his own father standing on a storm-lashed pier with a silenced pistol aimed at his forehead, whispering the revelation that would shatter everything Mark thought he knew about his own existence. But that was later. 13 hours earlier, at 3:14 a.m. on the coastal road, there was only the cold and the fog and the refusal of a machine to work. Mark's breath came out in thick, white plumes. He was hunched against the blue vending machine, the Coastal Times, his neon yellow safety vest stained with the sweat of a long shift. He slammed the heel of his palm against the coin slot. Metal groaned. Nothing yielded. The Atlantic roared somewhere beyond the fog, a distant, hollow percussion against the pilings. He pulled a flathead screwdriver from his back pocket, its yellow handle cracked from years of abuse. He jammed the tip into the gap between the door and the frame, put his weight behind it. The door pops open 2 inches, rough and sudden. There, wedged into the internal spring mechanism, a cream-colored envelope, heavy cardstock, the kind that cost money. His cold, reddened fingers reached inside, brushing against the metal interior, sharp, industrial, cold. He pinched the corner of the envelope and pulled. Rust flakes scattered onto the wet pavement below. No name, no address, only a red wax seal, pressed with an anchor motif, and the weight of it in his palm, unexpected. Heavier than it should have been. Mark turned it over, looking for any clue. The fog rolled in off the ocean, carrying salt and rot. Behind him, his idling delivery truck sat with its lights off, waiting. He had maybe 20 more stops before dawn. 47 papers left in the bundle on the passenger seat. The job was always the same. Push the papers into the machines, collect the coins, move on. But this envelope wasn't part of the routine. He ripped the top with his thumb. The sound was loud in the dead air. A small microcassette tape fell into his palm. Plastic, black, the kind nobody used anymore. And folded beneath it, a single piece of yellow legal paper. He unfolded the paper with shaking fingers. Typewritten text. A single line. The price of the pier. Mark's eyes went up. The empty road stretched into darkness on both sides. Just the fog and the occasional sodium lamp, and the sound of his own breathing filling the space where his heart should have been. He stuffed the tape into his jacket pocket and slammed the vending machine door shut with his boot. The clang echoed down the coast road, swallowed immediately by the mist. His hands were trembling as he walked back to the truck. The headlights cut through the fog like twin blades. He didn't know yet. He couldn't have known. The tape was still warm from being pressed against his ribs. The coffee shop was closed, dark, locked tight. But the back door, the one near the alley, could be opened if you knew the trick. Mark had known the trick for 3 years, ever since he'd started delivering papers to the Daily Grind every morning at 4 a.m. The owner, Danny, never minded. Mark would stack the papers by the register and leave a cup of coffee sitting on the counter for when the first shift came in. This morning was different. He had an old handheld microcassette recorder in his truck, a Sony M450 from maybe 1995. He'd grabbed it on impulse, something inside him knowing that whatever was on the tape, he needed to hear it alone, in private, before anything else happened. He held it loosely in his right hand as he jogged toward the back entrance. A gray blur came out of nowhere. The hit was shoulder to chest, a tackle that drove the air from his lungs and his body into the brick wall. The recorder flew from his hand, skittering across the pavement. Pain bloomed across his shoulder blades. His vision sparked. A figure in a gray hoodie, face hidden. a rusted iron pipe, already raised and coming down toward Mark's head. The world moved in slow motion and fast forward simultaneously. Mark's survival instinct overrode thought. He ducked. The pipe whistled past his ear. A green glass Heineken bottle on the ground shattered as the pipe connected, and fragments erupted upward like a fountain, catching the dim light from the alley's single fixture. Mark drove his knee upward. His attacker doubled over, breath knocked loose. Mark grabbed a heavy metal trash can lid, spun and swung. The impact was solid. The sound was like a bell, a deep, resonant gong that reverberated down the alley. Sparks flew. The lid collided with the pavement, spinning away. The attacker stumbled backward, blood dripping from under his hood. He turned and ran, limping into the fog, disappearing before Mark could follow. Footsteps faded. Coughing echoed once, twice, and then nothing. Mark leaned against the truck bed, hands shaking violently. His jaw throbbed. His side burned where he'd hit the wall. He could taste blood, his own, metallic and warm. The recorder lay on the pavement, cracked but intact. He picked it up, fingers unsteady, and pressed play, hissing white noise. Static. Then a voice. Grainy, distant, but unmistakable. A voice he'd heard on the news, in the town square, at community events. The mayor, Arthur Sterling. The voice was cold, calculated, the kind of whisper meant to be recorded, preserved, used. The mayor wants the land. Use the blackmail on Elias. He's family. He'll fold. That was all. 30 seconds of tape. The rest was blank. But those words, those 30 seconds, meant that Mark's uncle Elias, his mother's brother, the man who built birdhouses in his workshop bus and drank bourbon on his back porch, was part of something dark and hidden. Mark turned off the recorder. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The tape was still inside, wound tight, containing secrets that had been buried long enough. He got back into his truck. It was 4:43 a.m. The sun was still an hour away. The workshop was set back from the main road, surrounded by pines and overgrown blackberry vines. Mark had been here 100 times. Family Thanksgivings, helping Elias rebuild a deck, sitting in the corner while his uncle carved wood. It was a place that smelled like sawdust and possibility, like something was being made from nothing. This morning, he kicked the heavy wooden door open and stood in the doorway, breathing hard. Sawdust swirled in the shafts of early light coming through the north windows. The circular saw sat dormant on its stand. Stacks of unfinished birdhouses lined the walls, cedar, pine, oak, all waiting for the final touch, the perfect mounting hardware, the weatherproof stain. Elias was at his workbench, head in his hands. He was surrounded by shavings and the detritus of a man who had stopped working. There was a half-empty bottle of bourbon beside his left hand. Mark stepped inside and slammed the recorder onto the workbench, right between Elias's arms. The plastic clack made his uncle jump, his whole body jerking upright as if electrocuted. "Explain this, Elias. What did you do for Mayor Sterling?" Mark's voice came out rough, strange in his own ears. His uncle looked at him with eyes that had aged a decade overnight. Elias's face was gray. His hands trembled. Elias didn't speak at first. He just reached under his toolkit and pulled out a photograph. Black and white, old. He slid it across the wooden surface toward Mark. A young woman, Mark's mother, Sarah, smiling, standing with her hand in that of a man whose face had been deliberately burned out by the smoldering tip of a cigarette. The hole in the paper was methodical, precise. Someone had wanted to erase that face, but not the intimacy of the gesture, the way her hand rested in his, the angle of her body toward him. Mark picked up the photograph with shaking fingers. Elias's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. cracking, wet. He's got the matchbox, Mark, the one with my prints. He'll bury me if I don't give him the pier land. What fire? 20 years ago. An insurance claim. There was a squatter in the old cannery. I thought it was empty. I thought... Elias's hands came up to cover his face. His shoulders shook. No tears came, just the dry heaving of a man who had cried all the tears his body could produce. I started the fire. He died. The mayor was just a lawyer then. He found evidence. The matchbox. My prints. He's been using it ever since. Mark looked at the photograph again, at the careful erasure of the man's face, at the way his mother smiled. Why is his face burned out? Because I couldn't stand looking at him. Who is he? Elias didn't answer. He just stared at the workbench, at nothing, at everything, at the 20 years of silence stretching behind him like a shadow. Mark's eyes dropped to the signature at the bottom of the photograph. There, in faded pen, Arthur Sterling. The same man's voice was on the tape. The same man who had had his face burned out by a cigarette. The same man who had held Sarah Miller's hand with an intimacy that suggested nothing public, nothing proper. The same man who was now blackmailing Elias into giving up the town's most valuable piece of land. Mark's father. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. The realization moved through him like cold water, like poison, like the knowledge of something that couldn't be unknown. He left the photograph on the workbench and walked out of the workshop. Behind him, his uncle's breathing was the only sound, rough, ragged, the sound of a man drowning in air. Part 2. Double trouble. The coastal highway was wet from an overnight rain, and the morning sun hit the moisture in a way that turned the road into a mirror. Mark could see the underside of clouds reflected in the asphalt. He could see his future distorted in that wet surface, transformed into something unrecognizable. He wasn't following a plan so much as following impulse. The black Mercedes was parked outside the library where the mayor's assistant worked. A man named Richard Thorne, the one everyone said held the mayor's secrets, the one who made the calls, the one who smiled with too many teeth. Mark had seen him at events, always half a step behind Sterling, always watching. The Mercedes pulled out of the parking lot at 6:47 a.m. Mark was in his truck, 3 cars back. The morning traffic was light. He could follow without being noticed. The impulse was simple and clear and dangerous. Find Thorne, find out what he knows, find out if Elias was telling the truth or if there was more, so much more. The Mercedes accelerated. So did Mark. The highway curved north, away from town, toward the cliffs where the road narrowed and the ocean became visible. No more traffic, just the 2 vehicles on a ribbon of asphalt that twisted along the edge of the water. Mark closed the distance. 2 car lengths. 1, the Mercedes braked hard. Red lights flared. Mark's instinct screamed at him to slow, but something pushed his foot down instead. The truck lurched forward, closing the gap. The Mercedes's rear end swung out, a deliberate maneuver, a professional move. The rear bumper caught the corner of Mark's truck with a sound like a giant scream. Metal crumpled, glass shattered. His side mirror flew away, spinning out toward the ocean, disappearing into the salt air. Mark's hands jerked the wheel. The truck skidded toward the guardrail. He could see the ocean churning 50 feet below, gray and violent and cold. He could see exactly how easy it would be to go over. How simple. How final. Countersteering. A move he'd learned years ago, back when he was young and reckless. The truck responded, sliding left, back into the center line. Mark corrected and accelerated, ramming the driver's side of the Mercedes, forcing it toward the center line and the oncoming traffic lane. The Mercedes accelerated, pulling away, weaving through a group of logging trucks. Mark had to brake hard to avoid a head-on collision with a Mack truck's chrome grille. The air horn blasted, a massive primal sound that seemed to shake his entire truck. Brake lights glowed red in the morning mist. The Mack truck's driver was leaning on the horn, waving his fist. By the time Mark cleared the collision, the Mercedes was gone. Disappeared around a curve, or turned off on a side road, or accelerated to a speed the old F-150 could never match. Mark pulled over to the shoulder, tires crunching on gravel. He sat there, breathing hard, chest heaving, hands locked on the steering wheel. The dashboard was intact, except for a crack in the plastic where he'd hit it out of frustration or fear or both. His phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Stay in the truck and drive away." Mark stared at those words for a long time. They were a warning. They were a threat. They were someone telling him to stop, to back off, to accept that he was in something too deep, too organized, too professionally violent. They were the sound of a door closing. He started the truck and drove away. But not to work, not to his apartment. Instead, he drove toward town, toward the library, toward the municipal records that everyone said held the truth of things. The basement was dust-heavy, air thick with the detritus of centuries. Boxes were stacked on shelves that reached toward a ceiling lost in shadow. Mark found the section labeled Municipal Records, 1990-2000. And pulled down a leather-bound ledger. Dust exploded into the air like sudden fog. He flipped through the heavy pages, fingers tracing entries. Real estate transfers, property deed notations, everything organized with the obsessive precision of small-town bureaucracy. He found the section for 1995. There, a deed for a cottage on the outskirts of town, oceanside property. The buyer was listed as Sterling Holdings Limited. But the occupant, the one listed for the subsequent 5 years, was Sarah Miller. His mother's name. His hands went numb. The page seemed to shift under his fingers, as if the ink was still wet, still living, still telling lies. He was so focused on the deed that he almost didn't notice the document tucked between the pages. A birth certificate. Pale green paper with an embossed seal. His name at the top in calligraphy, Mark Aaron Miller. Born May 14th, at Coastal Hospital. Mother, Sarah Miller. Father. Line struck through, blank, erased. But at the bottom, the witness signature was clear. Unmistakable. Burned into the page as if by heat or pressure or fury. Arthur Sterling. A shadow fell across the page. Mark spun around. A librarian was standing there, a middle-aged woman he'd seen before, the one who always looked exhausted. But she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the door. 2 men in suits stood in the basement entrance. Expensive suits. Cold eyes. The kind of men who had been hired to solve problems, and Mark was a problem that needed solving. Mark ripped the page out of the ledger. The librarian gasped. He stuffed the birth certificate into his jacket pocket and turned over a metal cart. Books cascading across the linoleum floor in an avalanche of paper and spine and binding. He sprinted toward the emergency exit at the far end of the basement. The red sign glowed like a promise. Exit. He hit the push bar with his full weight and burst through. Behind him, heavy footsteps echoed, growing closer, then fading as he took the stairs 2 at a time and emerged into daylight. He ran. The streets of the town passed in a blur. Familiar streets, streets he'd walked his whole life, streets that were suddenly hostile and transformed and full of hidden threat. His apartment was destroyed. Mark stood in the doorway, unable to move forward or backward. The mattress was sliced open, long, deliberate cuts that had spilled the filling everywhere. Books were shredded. The television was smashed. Feathers from the pillows floated in the air like snow, catching the afternoon light that came through the broken window. The message was clear. We can reach you. We can destroy what's yours. We can take everything. He walked through the chaos without touching anything. His kitchen table was the only thing left untouched. Sitting on its surface was a single white envelope, identical to the one in the vending machine, except this one had his name written on it in neat, precise letters. Mark Miller. He opened it with numb fingers. Inside was a Polaroid photograph. Grainy, harsh light. His uncle Elias tied to a chair in a dark basement, rope binding his wrists, duct tape covering his mouth. A hand was holding the microcassette tape in front of his uncle's face. A detail so theatrical, so deliberate, that it could only be a message about control and knowledge and the price of secrets. Mark turned the photograph over. Written on the back in the same precise handwriting, "Estate at midnight. Bring the original or he dies. Mi omom." He looked at the time on his phone. 5:47 p.m. He had 6 hours and 13 minutes. He found the iron wrench in his toolbox on the floor. It was cold in his hand, heavy, real. He gripped it and felt something crystallize inside him. The running was over. The doubt was over. Whatever came next, he would face it carrying metal and intention. Part 3. No way out. The wrought iron fence was 12 feet high, ornate with decorative spikes meant to discourage rather than kill. Mark scaled it anyway, his boots kicking against the bars, his hands finding purchase in the iron lattice. He dropped down the other side, hitting the undergrowth hard enough to rattle his teeth. Ferns. Thick, wet soil that clung to his clothes. The forest was dark. The moon was hidden behind clouds that had rolled in from the Atlantic. He stayed low, crawling through the plant matter, keeping his breathing shallow and controlled. The estate was a quarter-mile in. He could see lights through the trees, the mansion blazing with illumination, security floods creating zones of harsh brightness and impenetrable shadow. A flashlight beam swept across the forest floor, inches from his face. Mark froze, his cheek pressed into cold mud. The tactical boots of a security guard stopped 3 feet away. Mark counted his heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. The guard's radio crackled with static. A voice called out something about the perimeter. The guard turned away. Mark moved like liquid. He lunged from the mud and tackled the guard around the waist, driving him into a tree trunk. Air exploded from the guard's lungs. The flashlight flew from his hand, spinning on the ground, the beam illuminating snatches of their struggle. An arm, a face, earth and blood, and violence. The guard threw a punch. It caught Mark in the jaw, snapping his head sideways, filling his mouth with the taste of copper. Mark responded with a brutal headbutt, driving his forehead into the bridge of the guard's nose. Something broke. Cartilage and bone giving way, with a wet crunching sound. Blood exploded across the guard's face. Mark wrenched the guard's arm and choked him into unconsciousness using the crook of his own elbow. A careful application of pressure that left the man breathing but incapable of sound or struggle. The body went limp. Mark dragged it into the shadows beneath a thick evergreen, camouflaging it with branches and fallen needles. He took the guard's radio and earpiece. Static. Then a voice cutting through the frequency with military precision. Section 4. Report. Is the package on site? Mark realized there were dozens of guards. Maybe more. The estate wasn't a house, it was a fortress. He pressed his palm against his chest and felt the wrench through his jacket. Cold and real and utterly insufficient for what was coming. He moved through the forest toward the lights. The wine cellar was colder than the forest. Mark slipped through a heavy oak door and found himself surrounded by bottles. Thousands of them, organized in racks like ammunition. The single hanging bulb cast long shadows across the room. The concrete floor was stained with something dark. In the center of the space, under the bulb, Elias sat in a wooden chair. His head was slumped. Duct tape covered his mouth. His hands were bound with rope that had cut into the skin, drawing thin lines of blood. Mark ran to him, whispering his uncle's name. He used his pocket knife to cut the rope, binding his wrists and ankles. His fingers worked quickly, methodically. The last rope fell away. Mark reached for the duct tape, about to peel it from Elias's face, when his uncle's eyes met his. Not gratitude, not relief. Pure, absolute terror. Elias shook his head violently. A desperate, emphatic gesture that meant a no. Stop. Don't. Run. A voice boomed from the shadows behind Mark. He's not the one you should be worried about, Mark. Mayor Arthur Sterling stepped into the light, and he was wearing a tuxedo. Black tie, perfectly pressed. A silenced pistol hung at his side with the casualness of a man who knew its weight, its purpose, its final word. The tape was a lure. I knew you'd find it. I knew you'd come here. The mayor looked exactly like his publicity photos. Silver hair, measured smile, the bearing of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Except his eyes were something else entirely. Something that had moved beyond human calculation into a realm where other people were just obstacles to be removed. He held up a piece of paper. The birth certificate Mark had stolen from the library. He struck a match. The flame caught the corner of the document. The paper began to curl, to blacken, to turn to ash. I spent 20 years keeping this quiet, Sterling said, watching the fire. I spent 20 years paying your uncle to keep you away, and now it's ending. The mayor gestured with the gun. 2 guards emerged from the wine racks, men Mark hadn't even known were there. They grabbed his arms, their gloved hands implacable and strong. Mark struggled, but there were 2 of them, and they were trained, and his moment of advantage was over. They forced him to his knees. The concrete was cold. Sterling leaned in close, smelling of expensive cologne and ash. His voice was a whisper. I'm your father, Mark, and now I have to kill you to save myself. The pier extended into the Atlantic like an accusation. Rain fell in vertical sheets, driven sideways by wind that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Below, the ocean slammed into the wooden pilings with the sound of cannons. Mark was pushed onto the planks, and the shock of the rain hitting his face was like a baptism into a colder version of the world. Elias was somewhere behind him. A guard's hand wrapped around his coat. The wind howled like a living thing. Lightning flickered on the horizon, illuminating the roiling sea in brief, apocalyptic flashes. Sterling stood at the edge of the pier, his silver hair plastered to his skull by rain, his tuxedo soaked and clinging to his frame. He looked at Mark with something that might have been pity. Your mother was the only thing I ever loved, he shouted over the wind. But the town, the power, it was more important. Mark said nothing. There was nothing to say. Sterling leaned in close, and even in the roar of the storm, his voice cut through with surgical precision. You aren't just Sarah's son. You're mine. I've been paying Elias to keep you away for 25 years. The words landed like a physical blow. Everything that Mark thought he was, his entire construction of self, of origin, of legitimate place in the world, collapsed into the ocean below. Sterling raised the silenced pistol. The barrel pointed at Mark's forehead. Behind them, a guard held Elias over the railing, ready to drop him into the black water. Mark looked down at his hands. He still had the tape hidden in his sleeve, the one thing his father didn't know about, the one advantage that remained. Lightning struck a tree on the shore, a massive, jagged crack of light and sound. The world turned white-blue for a moment. In that infinitesimal split second of distraction, Mark lunged forward, not for the gun, for Sterling's legs. They collided, and the momentum carried them both across the slippery planks. The gun fired twice, two loud bangs that echoed across the ocean, the flashes illuminating the rain like strobe lights. Mark drove his elbow into Sterling's chin, and the mayor's head snapped back with a sound like thunder. The guard holding Elias turned to help his employer. Mark's boot came up from the ground in a perfect arc, connecting with the guard's knee. The leg bent at an unnatural angle. The guard screamed, a sound higher than human, and let go of Elias. Elias scrambled back onto the pier on his own. Mark grabbed the pistol from Sterling's weakening grip and tossed it into the ocean. It tumbled through the rain and disappeared into the black water with a plink that was barely audible over the roar. Mark grabbed Elias's coat and pulled him toward the shore, as other guards rushed the pier, their footsteps heavy on the wooden planks. Flashlight beams searched the chaos of rain and darkness. Mark and Elias ran toward a small boathouse at the edge of the property. The door was locked, but Mark kicked it open. Inside, the smell of fuel and salt and oil. His hand found a flare gun on the wall, orange plastic, absurdly bright against the darkness. He turned and aimed it at a row of outboard motor fuel cans stacked against the far wall. He pulled the trigger. The flare arced through the boathouse and connected with the cans. The explosion was immediate and massive. A sound like the end of the world, a fireball that erupted through the wooden walls and consumed everything in sight. Orange fire consumed the pier, consumed the guards, consumed the boathouse. Mark and Elias burst out the back and ran through the smoke toward the truck that Mark had left idling in the woods earlier. The forest behind them was glowing with the orange light of the fire. The engine roared as Mark jammed it into gear and pressed the accelerator to the floor. The truck screamed forward, and in the rearview mirror, Mark watched the growing inferno consume the mayor's private pier, watched the smoke rise into the storm, watched everything burn. Part 4. Resolution. The newsroom was empty and fluorescent bright at 2 a.m. The only sound was the hum of the machines and the distant mechanical whir of the printing press in the basement. Waiting. Mark walked past the empty desks, his clothes soaked and charred, water dripping from his sleeves onto the clean carpet. Clara was in her office. The editor, an old woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen every story a small town could tell. She looked up from her computer screen as Mark entered, and her expression moved from confusion to recognition to shock in the space of a single breath. "The building's closed," she said, but not with any real conviction. Mark pulled the microcassette tape from his pocket and placed it on her glass desk. Beside it, he set the birth certificate, the one he'd saved from the fire, now singed at the edges, the ink still readable despite the burn marks. The document was evidence. It was truth. It was the destruction of everything Arthur Sterling had built. "Print it," Mark said. Clara looked at the tape, then at the certificate, then at Mark. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She simply put the tape into a player and pressed play. Sterling's voice filled the quiet office. Cold, calculated, admitting to the blackmail, admitting to the fire, admitting to everything. Clara listened to every word, her hand moving to her glasses, pushing them up on her nose. When the tape ended, she pulled the certificate closer and read it in silence. "My God," she said. Mark watched her start typing. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the practiced precision of someone who had been waiting her entire career for a story this big. The rapid clicking filled the newsroom, a sound like fate crystallizing into words and sentences and paragraphs that would run in tomorrow's edition. He walked to the window and looked down at the empty street below. In the morning, every paper he delivered would carry the headline that destroyed his father's legacy. The machinery was set in motion now. There was nothing left to do but let it run. He could see the first blue light of dawn beginning to cut into the darkness on the horizon. Mayor Sterling's pristine front porch was quiet and cold. Mark stood on it at 6 a.m., holding a freshly printed newspaper. The headline was massive, impossible to miss. Mayor's blackmail exposed below it. Smaller, but equally devastating. Illegitimate heir reveals truth. Mark's hand was steady as he gripped the paper. His clothes were still damp. His face was bruised, but his eyes were clear. The front door opened. Arthur Sterling stood in the threshold wearing a silk robe. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 12 hours. His face was gray. His hands were trembling. When he saw the newspaper, his entire body seemed to collapse inward. He looked at the paper, then at Mark, father and son, standing on the threshold between what was and what would never be again. Mark didn't say a word. He held out the newspaper. Their fingers touched for just a moment, a brief, cold contact. The paper changed hands. Mark turned and walked away. At the end of the driveway, the blue and red lights of police cruisers appeared like a reckoning. They strobed across the white walls of the estate, painting everything in alternating colors of accusation. Behind him, Mark heard Sterling sink onto the porch step, heard the rustle of the newspaper in the morning air, heard the sound of a man's entire existence crumbling into ash. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out the red wax seal. The anchor motif, the detail that had started everything. He tossed it into the tall grass at the edge of the property. The wax disappeared into the green, lost and forgotten, and finally gone. He kept walking toward the rising sun,